Hello everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're not just looking at negotiations, we're trying to understand why they may already be failing. Because from the outside, everything looks like progress. Meetings are being planned, delegations are moving, statements are being softened, and yet, the structure beneath those negotiations is telling a very different story. The ceasefire was not a breakthrough. It was a pause that came at the exact moment escalation reached its limit. And that matters. Because when escalation stops suddenly, it doesn't always mean resolution. Sometimes it means the system could not handle more pressure. And when a system reaches that point, negotiations don't begin from strength, they begin from constraint. So the real question is not, will negotiations succeed? The real question is, are these negotiations even built to succeed in the first place? Because when you look closely, you start to see something uncomfortable. The sides involved are not just disagreeing on terms, they are disagreeing on the structure of the conflict itself. And when that happens, negotiations don't just struggle, they become unstable from the beginning. To understand why these negotiations are likely to fail, we have to move beyond headlines. We have to look at the system underneath. Because negotiations don't fail simply because leaders don't want peace. They fail because the structure of the conflict makes agreement difficult to sustain. And right now, that structure is deeply misaligned. Different definitions of the same conflict. Let's start with the most important problem. Both sides are not negotiating the same conflict. From the US perspective, this is a limited confrontation, a conflict that can be contained, managed, reduced to a set of specific issues: Iran's military behavior, regional stability, maritime security. From this perspective, the goal is simple: reduce escalation, stabilize the situation, and move forward step by step. But from Iran's perspective, this is not a limited conflict. It is a regional system. It includes Lebanon, proxy networks, long-term pressure from sanctions, strategic positioning in the Middle East, and this changes everything. Because if Iran sees the conflict as regional, then any negotiation that excludes parts of that system, especially Lebanon, is incomplete. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Israel continues operations in Lebanon. The ceasefire does not fully include that front, and Iran is signaling clearly this is not acceptable. So now you have a situation where one side wants to negotiate a limited deal, the other wants a comprehensive framework. And when the scope is different, agreement becomes almost impossible because they are not solving the same problem. 2, the sequence problem. Who moves first? Now, let's move to the second issue. Even if both sides agreed on the structure, there's still a major problem: sequence. Who acts first? The United States is following a traditional approach. De-escalation first, then concessions, then gradual relief. This allows the US to maintain leverage, to ensure compliance before giving anything significant in return. But Iran sees this differently. From its perspective, sanctions are the main issue. Economic pressure is the real conflict. So Iran's position is remove sanctions first, then we can talk. This creates a deadlock because both sides are waiting, both sides are asking for the first move, and neither side trusts the other enough to take that risk. And without trust, sequence becomes a barrier, not a pathway. 3, the sanctions wall. Now, let's go deeper into sanctions. because this is not just a negotiation point. This is the core of the entire conflict. For the United States, sanctions are leverage. They are the primary tool of pressure. Without sanctions, Iran's economy stabilizes, its oil exports increase, its global connections expand. So, from a US perspective, removing sanctions completely would mean losing control over the negotiation. But for Iran, sanctions are not leverage. They are suffocation. They define the conflict. They are the reason negotiations exist in the first place. So Iran is not asking for partial relief. It is asking for full removal. And that is a problem because full removal is something the US cannot easily agree to. Not politically, not strategically, not economically. So now you have a situation where Iran sees sanctions removal as non-negotiable. The US sees sanctions as non-removable, at least immediately. And that creates a wall, a structural wall that no amount of diplomacy can easily bypass. 4, the Strait of Hormuz, control of the system. Now, let's move to something even bigger. The Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a shipping route. It is one of the most important choke points in the global economy. A significant portion of the world's oil passes through it. And recently, Iran has tried to use that position by attempting to impose tolls on ships. Now, on the surface, this looks like an economic move, but it's not. It's a power move. It's an attempt to control a critical part of the global system. And this is where things become serious, because the United States cannot accept that. Not because of the money, but because of what it represents. If Iran can charge tolls, then it controls the flow. And if it controls the flow, it gains leverage over the global economy. So now this is no longer just a regional issue. It becomes a system-level conflict. And when conflicts reach that level, they become much harder to resolve through negotiation because the stakes are no longer local. They are global. 5, the trust deficit. Now, let's talk about trust. Because without trust, no negotiation can survive. And right now, trust is almost non-existent. Iran does not trust the United States. It has seen previous agreements collapse, sanctions reimposed, policies reversed. So, from Iran's perspective, even if a deal is signed, there is no guarantee it will last. And this is why Iran wants something more. Not just a deal, but a guarantee. Which brings us to China. China as a guarantor. Iran wants China involved, not just as a participant, but as a guarantor. Why? Because China changes the balance. A US-only agreement means the US controls enforcement, the US controls consequences. But a China-backed agreement introduces balance, stability, a counterweight. For Iran, this reduces risk. But for the US, this creates a problem because it reduces control and introduces a competitor into the structure of the agreement. So now, negotiations are not just about Iran and the US. They are about global power, about influence, about who gets to shape the outcome. And that makes things even more complicated. 7, time, pressure, and political reality. Now, add one more layer, time. Negotiations are happening under pressure. Deadlines, public expectations, political narratives, and when time is limited, decisions become harder because complex problems cannot be solved quickly. but the system demands quick results, and that creates a mismatch between what is needed and what is possible. 8. The illusion of progress. Finally, let's address something important. From the outside, it looks like progress is being made. Talks are happening. Statements are positive. But in reality, most of the core issues remain unresolved. And this creates an illusion that negotiations are moving forward, when in fact, they are stuck at the structural level. Part 1, conclusion. So, when you put all of this together, a clear picture emerges. These negotiations are not failing because of a single issue. They are struggling because of multiple structural conflicts happening at the same time. Different definitions of the conflict: disagreement over sequence, the sanctions deadlock, control of global systems like Hormuz, lack of trust, power competition involving China, time pressure, and the illusion of progress. Each of these alone is difficult. Together, they make success unlikely. In part 2, we will go deeper. We will examine what happens next, how each side adapts, and whether this situation leads to resolution or simply another phase of conflict. Because sometimes negotiations don't fail immediately, they fail slowly. And that may already be happening. And even if we assume for a moment that these negotiations somehow move forward, that the meetings happen, the statements become more positive, and eventually an agreement is placed on the table, there is still a deeper question that cannot be ignored. Not whether a deal can be reached, but whether that deal can survive the system that created it. Because agreements do not exist in isolation. They exist inside structures, inside pressures, inside competing incentives that do not disappear simply because a document has been signed. And this is where the real fragility begins. Because when you look at the current situation, you begin to realize that the conditions forcing negotiation have not actually been resolved. They have only been paused. The military pressure has not disappeared. It has only been contained. The economic tension has not been solved. It has only been delayed. The political disagreements have not been aligned. They have only been softened. And when the underlying conditions remain active, agreements become temporary by design. Not because anyone intends to break them immediately, but because the system continues to generate the same pressures that led to conflict in the first place. This is where we need to understand something important. A negotiation can succeed in form and fail in function. It is entirely possible for these negotiations to produce an agreement that appears complete, coherent, and even successful on the surface, yet remains fundamentally unstable underneath. Because stability in geopolitics does not come from signatures, ceremonies, or official statements. It comes from alignment. And in this case, that alignment is still missing at a structural level. The United States is entering these negotiations with a clear objective to stabilize the situation, reduce immediate risk, prevent escalation, and maintain control over critical systems such as regional balance and global energy flows. From Washington's perspective, the goal is containment, managing the conflict, so it does not expand or disrupt broader strategic interests. But Iran is approaching the same negotiations from a very different position. Its objective is not merely to reduce pressure, but to transform its place within the system itself, to break free from sanctions, secure long-term economic continuity, and expand its regional influence. These two sets of goals are not entirely incompatible, but they are not fully aligned either. And that distinction matters, because what emerges from such a situation is not a true resolution, but a temporary overlap, a narrow space where interests intersect just enough to make an agreement possible. The problem is that this overlap is inherently unstable. The moment one side begins to move beyond that shared space, the agreement begins to weaken. What looks like resolution is, in reality, a pause built on shifting ground. This is only the first layer of instability. The second lies in enforcement, arguably the most fragile component of any agreement. An agreement without a trusted and clearly defined enforcement mechanism is not a stable framework. It is a conditional arrangement dependent on interpretation and restraint. And here, uncertainty is unavoidable. If enforcement remains primarily in the hands of the United States, Iran perceives imbalance, a system where compliance is demanded from one side but controlled by the other. If enforcement is broadened to include external actors such as China, the United States sees a different risk, a dilution of control, a fragmentation of influence, and a loss of predictability. This unresolved tension over enforcement ensures that compliance will never be absolute. Each side will interpret the terms in ways that favor its interests. Each will test boundaries gradually and deliberately. These are not dramatic violations, but small, incremental deviations, subtle adjustments that accumulate over time. And it is through this accumulation that agreements begin to erode. Not through a single collapse, but through a slow, almost invisible process of friction, suspicion, and diminishing trust. Complicating this further is the role of actors who exist outside the formal structure of the agreement. This is not a conflict defined solely by centralized control. It is a distributed system shaped by multiple layers of influence. Lebanon remains active. Proxy networks remain engaged. Regional tensions continue to operate independently of diplomatic frameworks. These actors are not bound by the same constraints, nor are they directly accountable to the agreement. Yet their actions have immediate consequences. A single escalation in Lebanon can destabilize the entire balance. A single maritime incident can shift global perceptions of risk. A single miscalculation can trigger a chain reaction that pulls all parties back into confrontation. This is the inherent fragility of distributed systems. Stability does not depend on one decision maker, but on the behavior of every connected component. And the more distributed the system, the harder it becomes to control. Even if we assume partial or full sanctions relief, the economic dimension introduces another layer of complexity. Economic systems do not reset instantly. Trade does not normalize overnight. Investment does not return on command. Confidence, once broken, rebuilds slowly. There is always a lag between agreement and outcome, and during that lag, uncertainty dominates. This gap creates a dangerous mismatch between expectation and reality. Iran expects rapid economic relief. The United States expects measurable compliance. But the system moves at its own pace, slower than political timelines and public expectations. When results fail to match promises, disappointment emerges. That disappointment quickly turns into suspicion, and suspicion evolves into doubt. Over time, this doubt begins to weaken the agreement from within, long before any formal breakdown occurs. Overlaying all of this is the pressure of domestic politics. No agreement exists in isolation from internal realities. Leaders must justify their decisions, present outcomes as victories, and navigate competing narratives within their own political systems. In the United States, critics will argue that any agreement is too weak, too concessional, insufficient to guarantee long-term stability. In Iran, opposition voices will claim the agreement does not go far enough, that it fails to fully eliminate pressure or secure meaningful guarantees. These internal pressures do not subside after an agreement is signed. They intensify because once the agreement becomes real, it becomes measurable, debatable, and vulnerable to criticism. Over time, these pressures can force reinterpretations, delays, or even withdrawal. This is how agreements begin to unravel, not from external shocks alone, but from internal strain that gradually reshapes the political will to sustain them. At the same time, key structural tensions remain unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz continues to represent a fundamental point of disagreement. For Iran, it is leverage, a strategic asset that can be used to assert influence without direct confrontation. For the United States and its allies, it is a critical artery of the global economy that must remain open and unrestricted. These positions are rooted in fundamentally different views of control and cannot be easily reconciled. Even if tensions around the strait temporarily decrease, the underlying conflict remains embedded in the system, ready to resurface under pressure. Beneath all of this lies a broader transformation in global power dynamics. The United States is attempting to maintain its position within the international system. China is expanding its influence, both economically and diplomatically. Iran is navigating between these forces, leveraging competition to its advantage. This creates a multi-layered strategic environment in which any agreement is not just about resolving a specific conflict, but about shaping long-term positioning. In such an environment, competition does not disappear when negotiations succeed. It continues in parallel, influencing behavior, altering incentives, and introducing new variables that were never part of the original framework. Stability, therefore, is never absolute. It is conditional, constantly shaped by forces operating beyond the agreement itself. It is also important to recognize the nature of agreements made under pressure. These agreements are designed to achieve immediate objectives to stop escalation, create breathing space, and reduce risk in the short term. They are not necessarily designed to resolve the deeper structural causes of conflict. This creates a gap between short-term success and long-term stability. In the immediate aftermath, the agreement appears effective. Tensions decrease, signals soften, the system stabilizes, at least temporarily. But over time, unresolved issues begin to reemerge. They were never eliminated, only postponed. And postponed problems do not disappear. They accumulate. They persist beneath the surface until conditions bring them back into focus. When we step back and view the system as a whole, a clear pattern emerges. The core dynamics of the conflict remain unchanged. The pressures are still active. The incentives are still competing. Trust remains limited. And in a system where these foundational elements are unstable, any agreement built within that system inherits that instability. This shifts the way we should think about success. Success is not the moment an agreement is signed. It is the ability of that agreement to endure, to withstand pressure, adapt to changing conditions, and maintain alignment over time. And that is where the real challenge lies. Because sustaining alignment in a system this complex requires more than diplomacy. It requires coordination, consistency, and a structural environment capable of supporting it. Right now, that environment does not fully exist. The system remains under pressure, still evolving, still searching for balance, which means that even if a deal is reached, the real test does not end at the negotiating table. It begins there. Because in geopolitics, failure is rarely immediate. It is rarely dramatic. More often, it is gradual, a slow shift, a slow erosion, a slow return to the same pressures that created the conflict in the first place. By the time that failure becomes visible, it has already been forming beneath the surface for weeks or months. This is the deeper reality of the current moment. What we are witnessing is not simply a negotiation. It is a system attempting to stabilize itself under sustained pressure, trying to create order in an environment defined by uncertainty. And that is one of the most difficult challenges in international politics. Because order requires consistency. And consistency is extremely difficult to maintain in a system where every component is in motion. The conclusion then is not that these negotiations will fail because of unwillingness or lack of effort. They are likely to struggle because the system in which they exist makes lasting success inherently difficult. Peace, in this context, is not just an agreement. It is a condition, one that must be supported by alignment, reinforced by structure, and sustained across multiple layers of interaction. Until that condition exists, any agreement that emerges will remain fragile, temporary, conditional, always exposed to the risk of reversal. Because in the end, the outcome of any negotiation is not determined by what is written on paper. It is determined by whether the system itself can carry that agreement forward. And right now, that system is still under strain, still adjusting, still searching for equilibrium, which leaves us with the most important question of all. Even if a deal is reached, how long can it actually last?